Hello everyone, this is Jacob, and with me is...
Kevin.
Yeah, and we are recording our second episode of...
Mystery of Faith, Understanding the Christian Religion.
And as you might determine from the title, that this is the point of this podcast is to help those who would like to understand Christianity more, to figure out what does the Christian belief teach on certain subjects. And we take questions from everyone, and if you would have a question you'd like to ask us, you're welcome to go on to facebook.com and to search for Mystery of Faith, Understanding the Christian Religion. You'll find our Facebook page. On there is a form which you are welcome to fill out, and you can ask any question you want anonymously or not anonymously. And alternatively, if this suits you better, you can find us on Gmail at mysteryoffaithpdx@gmail.com. You can send us your questions there. We have one question from somebody. This is an anonymous question. And we're going to let Kevin take a shot at it. Kevin, what's the question and what's your perspective?
So the question was, can something be moral for one person and immoral for another? So I take it that this question is coming from a place of, I think we've all encountered, especially those of us who've been to college, someone saying something like, well, what's true for you isn't true for me, what's good for you isn't good for me, it just depends on you. I mean, sure, that's good for you, but it's not good for me. And underlying this is an idea that morality is relative. There's a recognition that certain cultures, certain people believe one thing is good and another thing is bad, and there's not really any framework from which we can judge an absolute morality. Of course, as Christians, our answer to this question of whether something can be good for one person and bad for another is to say no. There are several points we can break down in this, but to begin, we would just say that as Christians we believe that there is a moral order to the universe. This is parallel for us to the way that there is a physical order to the universe. So there's various scriptures, certainly a lot in the Psalms, that talk about the way that God ordered the universe. He put the stars in the heavens. He did various things that make the physical order of the universe what it is, and likewise there's the law of God that puts a moral order to the universe. So in the same manner that I can take a ball in my hand, and when I let go of the ball falls, hits the ground, maybe bounces, we would say that there is a moral order, so that it's wrong for me to stab babies. So that is absolute. There is, on a base level, there is good and there is bad, and that's the first level answer to the question. But I think that there are some ways we can nuance this question, and some important lessons we can draw out for how we need to live as Christians as well. Mm-hmm. So to kind of go through what I would do, first of all, to stress, first point, that the moral order in question is not arbitrary. Secondly, that because it's not arbitrary, there is a hierarchy to the goods in question, and that means that while there is no absolute sense in which something is right for someone and wrong for another person, there are contexts in which an action, which for the same person might be bad, might not be as bad. Third, that there are contexts that reduce someone's culpability for what they're doing, and so to unpack those points. The first one, that there is nothing arbitrary about the moral order. Going back to the analogy I gave of the physical order, something about the properties of the universe, the nature of the universe, that makes it the fact that if I let go of that ball is going to fall. There are physical properties in the ball, there are physical properties about the earth's center of gravity, that make that happen. In the same way, the Bible teaches us that God created the world, and in the sixth day he created humanity, male and female, in the image of God. Which is to say, the nature that we have as human persons is something that is fixed, and the nature of God is fixed. And later on in the story, as it were, in Scripture, we learn that God commands through Jesus Christ that the greatest commandment is to love God, and the second commandment, which is like unto it, is to love your neighbor as yourself. And these commandments, this nature is built into what it is to be human. And there are things that suit that, and there are things that don't. So to go to another analogy, I like to cook. So one thing that I've discovered in my life is that there is nothing better for a good cooking experience than a good tool. And one of the best tools is a sharp knife, a knife that really cuts well. So let's imagine that I have a knife that really cuts well, and I could be using it to have that really great, chopping experience. But let's say that instead I have a project I need to do that involves hammering in a nail, and I decide I'm going to take that knife and hammer in that nail. What's going to happen? The knife's going to end up dull. I'm probably not going to, nail in the nail all that well. I mean, it might work, but maybe I can use the handle, but it's not going to work well. And the fact of the matter is that somebody, the designer of the knife, put together the knife for a very specific purpose, and all of the properties the knife has suit that purpose. Whereas a hammer is very good for a different purpose, which is nailing. Well, as a human person, we are created to worship God, to love God, and to love our neighbor. And there are things that suit that end, and there are things that don't. And those things which are built into our nature and are built into the nature of the universe are what we call the moral law. Obviously, the stabbing babies is very contrary to the command to love our neighbor. And so to conclude in that point is to say that this is not an issue where morality is arbitrary. There is a fixed moral law. It makes what is right for one person right for another person, but it's not just the sort of mean fiat of a God who wants to ruin your fun. Following up on that also means that there's a hierarchy of goods. So to draw out another distinction, I would argue, and a lot of people would dispute this, but I would argue that manners are actually an issue of morality. And the reason that manners are an issue of morality is that within a given context, within a given culture, the particular manners that we have, for example, in American English-speaking context, saying please and thank you, are ways in which we signal respect for other human beings. And that respect is the fundamental moral issue, but it's because of human nature and human culture, it becomes a moral issue to show that respect through manners. But, if I'm in the middle of a city in rural China where no one speaks English, obviously please and thank you don't mean much of anything. It's also a moral issue to protect the innocent, protect people who should not be hurt. So let's imagine that I'm hiding Jews in my house, and the Gestapo comes to my door, they knock on my door, and they say, hey, do you have any Jews hiding in your house? And I happen to know that, this particular individual is really sensitive and will go off in a huff if I'm rude to him. Well, there is a higher good to protecting the innocent than there is to showing respect through manners. And so it is a good for me in that context to be rude, even though in other contexts it might be immoral for me to be. So while it is not, good for me to do one thing and for Jacob to do another in a kind of abstract sense, in this particular context, it is good for me to do one thing rather than another. What's crucial here, though, is that we're not saying that the ends justify the means. We're not saying that it's okay to murder 10 people to save 200, or that it's okay to vote for Donald Trump to get rid of Hillary Clinton. What we're saying is that some goods outweigh other goods. An equal good, like the good of a human life, it does not outweigh the good of another human life. I mean, that's probably a different topic. But the point being, What we're not saying is that the ends justify the means. What we're saying is that some goods are of more importance than other goods, and that means that in one context in which one good is at play, it outweighs another. And so that's our second point. So go through again. Morality is absolute. Morality is not arbitrary, but it's relative to the nature of humanity. And there is a hierarchy of goods. That means that certain contexts might mean that one moral question will outweigh another. The sort of final point in this is that there are also issues of culpability. So just because something is wrong doesn't mean that someone is blameworthy for it. Let's imagine a child. He was somehow separated from his parents, raised by wolves on a desert island. I don't know. I'm mixing my metaphors, but you get the point. So this child raised by animals on a desert island has had no moral instruction. And they meet other people, and somehow they learn to speak, and they start lying left, right, and center. No one's ever taught them that they shouldn't be lying. And maybe they should know, but maybe, they've just lacked the instruction, they've lacked the context to teach them that this is wrong. Well, as Christians, we believe that God is just. And while that does mean that God enforces the moral law, it also means that God is fair to those who don't have the context to know to know any better. And so we do believe that context matters. To give a sort of concrete example, I'm a Catholic, as we mentioned in a first episode, and one of the important Catholic precepts is that every Catholic is morally obligated to go to Mass every Sunday, barring circumstances that would make that impossible, like severe sickness or a Mass just not being available in the area you happen to be in. But a lot of Catholics are ignorant of this teaching. Now, it is immoral for any Catholic to not go to Mass on Sunday, but it is not the fault of a Catholic who doesn't know to not go to Mass on Sunday. They ought to learn. There is an obligation. This fact of culpability doesn't mean that it's better to be ignorant, because one of our obligations is to pursue love of God and love of neighbor, and that means pursuing greater knowledge of what it is to be good. And so remaining in willful ignorance because you don't want to be culpable for other things you might do is itself something which you would be culpable for. So it's not about just getting you off the hook. But this is crucial because this kind of brings me to the final point of, well, what does all this mean for us as Christian believers? What do we actually do? The first precept is the love of God, which is to say, our first obligation as human persons is to do what we need to do to suit ourselves for the love of God and for the presence of God. And that means the shaping of our souls into the shape that suits us for the love of God. And that means that we are obligated to try our best to know what is good, to know what is true, and to pursue that to the best of our ability. There is, of course, and this is crucial as Christians, we believe in mercy, we believe in forgiveness. And that's a topic we really should cover, but that's not this topic, because we're going to stumble. And the second point is that one of the crucial pieces to us having a soul that is suited for the presence of God is that to love our neighbor is not benefited by us being weighed down in judgmental thoughts. So you don't know why a person is behaving the way they are. To give an example, as Christians, we believe it's crucial for us to worship God. It's crucial for us to, for example, spend time on Sundays in church worshiping God. But you're in church on Sunday, and let's imagine someone a few pews over, you see them on their cell phone. And it's not a very worshipful stance to be. They're texting someone. But maybe their mother's in the hospital and they've just found out and they're dealing with that situation. You don't know. And so it's easy for you to judge them, to feel bitter thoughts. But it's probably better for you to work on assuming that there are circumstances that justify what they're doing. Always assume the best of another person. when you're on the road and you're driving and someone cuts you off, I tend to swear and fly into a rage when that happens. But what I ought to be doing is saying, well, maybe they are in a rush because their mom's in the hospital or their child's sick, and they have a very good reason for what they're doing, and it's not how they would behave under normal circumstances. But a related sort of caveat to that is you don't not judge people, but you have to recognize your responsibility to people relative to your relationships with them. So Jacob is a good friend of mine, and maybe he's if he started to eat way too much, which if you knew him, and he's skinny as a rake, so it's kind of hilarious. But let's just say he started to really pig out and was gaining a bunch of weight and hurting his health. And I knew that more importantly, the way that he's eating is turning food into an idol. It would be incumbent upon me as his friend to say something, to say, hey, I think that you're turning food into an idol. I think that this is something that's hurting you spiritually, and you need to get help, or I'm willing to help you, or whatever. That's different than some random stranger on the corner who looks a little bit overweight to me and is eating something that I think might be contributing to that. I have no idea what's really going on, and I don't have either responsibility or really the right to wade into that situation and say, I think you're a glutton. So the summary of this conversation that we've been having and of what I've been saying is that the answer to the question of whether or not there is a moral that is good for me and not good for Jacob is no, but that there are contexts, because morality is relative not to Jacob or me, but to the ends of our nature, that complicate the question and mean that we have to approach every person with compassion. And first and foremost, we have to approach ourselves with the goal of growth in holiness. So that's my spiel on this subject. And Jacob, do you have any comments?
Oh, yeah, I think in a lot of ways I'll reiterate what you say, but I think one of the biggest things that I think about when I think about moral relativism, and that it's good for you and bad for me and vice versa, is that I think really where that comes from is primarily a very emotional type of thinking.
Right.
And people, I think more than ever, they don't want to be disagreed with. They don't want someone to tell them what's wrong. And to be fair, they don't want to be telling other people what's wrong. And so purely on an emotional level, because of that tension that exists in this world, they kind of create this ideology. But I don't think any of that ideology, if you really want to be consistent about it, has any logical grounding at all.
No, and it wouldn't follow through.
No.
I remember an instance when I was in college where a professor did a very sort of, let's say he did a couple of different things, but one particular neat trick, let's say, he did with the students. And he asked the students if they thought morality was relative. And a lot of them said yes. And he then began to tell a story. And the story he told was that British colonialists went into India. And they went into India and they said, we're going to enforce our morality on your culture. And there was something that they said the Indians needed to do. And the Indians said, can you just give us this one thing? It's super important to our culture. Just let us have this one thing. And as he's telling this story, and of course the British said, no, you can't do that. And as he's telling this story, the students are starting to get enraged. How can these awful, terrible colonial British do this to these poor Indians in India? And he writes a word on the board, and the word he writes on the board is sati, which is the practice, which was part of certain parts of the Hindu religion, in which if a husband died, the wife would be required to throw herself on his funeral pyre, commit suicide, and die.
By burning alive, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And this was the practice that those terrible colonialists came in and said you can't do. And of course the students were like, well, I wouldn't support that.
Yeah, and actually, I think it's worth mentioning now is that I think it's fair to say before all you guys are jumping in your seats is that Kevin nor I are going to be advocating for colonialism in the way it's been revealed in history.
And another story that he brought up was a case where a French couple hired a woman who happened to be from a culture in which female circumcision was practiced. And this woman ended up taking their daughter and circumcising her. Female circumcision and is more properly called female genital mutilation because it destroys a woman's capacity for, it's not like male circumcision.
They can't have orgasms and potentially probably won't have children and things like that.
And so this woman, because of her cultural context, felt it was a good thing to do to this daughter, but she was in the French. I mean, obviously we would not say, well, her culture said it was okay, so it was okay. So anyway, I was just...
Yeah, well, I mean, because I think it's just natural for a human being, if they really want to be realistic about their thinking, is that those things have intrinsic impacts that are negative on the world around them. And I think that people who want to vouch for moral relativism, I think they want to vouch for moral relativism on things that they do not think are a big deal, that they do not believe in. So it's like they're going to say, like, well, there's this man who's a rapist, and, rape he needs to be stopped because that has an intrinsic moral value. But then you want to, for someone who's irreligious, we'll look at religion and say, well, sex before marriage is morally relative because the reason why is because it's not a value that they have. It's not something that they believe in. And so they're kind of holding their moral standards as the pinnacle of what's objective and what's subjective, and I don't think that's a fair thing to do. Granted, you could say that Christians are, but that there's a whole conversation to have about that. You want to learn about that? Ask us a question. But I think what I want to emphasize again, that what you said is that this world, is very important for a Christian belief, is that this world is ordered, it's intelligently designed, and humans are intelligent designed, and it's ordered to be a certain way. Every action we commit has an impact. It kind of sends up these ripples on this world, and has an impact on the things around us, including human spirits and souls and bodies. And so, I mean...
And asterisks. When we say intelligently designed, we're not putting our toes, our hat in the race as far as evolution versus creationism debates. That's not what we're talking about.
We're not really
that's another conversation. If you want to ask us about it, please do.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But based on the intelligent design is that there's a reason why things are let's think about a feral child who is fending for himself and hasn't been taught morally and steals fruit from a market. That child's not culpable, but he's still, and I don't think any reasonable person is going to look at that person and say, and really condemn that child, but he's still hindering and impacting negatively that market and the market owner's ability to make a living.
And his own soul.
And his own soul.
Which is why he'll go to purgatory.
Sure. Another question to be asked. But it impacts things, and granted, I want to admit that it's really, really hard to figure out what each deed and how it impacts the world around us. Even with the Christian biblical moral standard that we have, it's still difficult to figure these things out.
Well,
but it's still, we have to acknowledge that there is something. There is an impact that's going to be had on the world around us, and we really need to strive to figure out what those impacts are. We can't have that conversation if we're going to get into moral relativism.
Right, and I think that's crucial because, you're right about that final point. And I think what you said about the Bible is crucial because we as Christians, I mentioned that we believe in a moral order. I don't think I mentioned that we also believe that we have insight into that moral order because God has given us divine revelation, which Jacob and I would both agree includes Scripture, and as a Catholic, I would also believe includes the Christian tradition. But neither Scripture nor the Christian tradition is exhaustive. I mean, that's why, as Catholics, you may or may not know as a listener, but, it's a fairly regular thing for there to be ongoing open moral debates in Catholicism. For example, it's sort of a settled thing in Catholicism that in vitro fertilization is, for a variety of reasons, wrong. But there's still an ongoing debate about whether, because there are women, of course, couples who do practice in vitro fertilization. One of the side effects of that is that there's a lot of embryos who are just sort of on ice, in limbo. Mm-hmm. And there are couples who've actually decided that one of the things that they want to do is actually take those couples. There's couples who have decided that one of the things they want to do is take those embryos who are in frozen storage and actually implant them in their own, bodies and have those children so that those children have a chance for life. And there's actually an ongoing current moral debate in Catholicism as to what the right thing to do in that situation is. What is morally obligatory, what is morally laudatory, and what is actually forbidden. And that's because, the world changes. A situation like that is not something that would have even been a moral question 100 years ago, let alone 2,000 years ago when Scripture was written. And so, there's an ongoing need to discuss, debate, and develop our moral understanding.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. We got to figure out how are our actions impacting the world around us.
So I think we've sort of exhausted what we can cover on this topic for the time being. But I'm sure you guys have questions, you have concerns. Please feel free to find us on Facebook. Again, just look up Mystery of Faith, Understanding the Christian Religion. You can find us. You can ask us questions. You can follow us. We would really appreciate your likes. And we would also especially appreciate if you submit questions to us either through that source or through our Gmail, which is mysteryoffaithpdx@gmail.com. Thank you, and God bless.
God bless. Bye-bye.